Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we will review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and discussed issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA professional development. For more information about us and certification maintenance hours, go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. SLP Nerdcast is brought to you in part by listeners like you. You can support our work by going to our website or social media pages and contributing. You can also find permanent products, notes, and other handouts, including a handout for this episode. Some items are free, others are not, but everything is always affordable. Visit our website, www.slpnerdcast.com, to submit a call for papers to come on the show and present with us. Contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to learn what you have to teach us.
Just a quick disclaimer, the contents of this episode are not meant to replace clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts, and its guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and fair representation of each topic that we tackle. That being said, it is always likely that there is an article we've missed or another perspective that isn't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We would love to hear from you.
Before we get started in today's episodes, financial and non-financial disclosures, I am the owner and founder of Grand Bois Therapy and Consulting, LLC, and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Amy Wonka is an employee of a public school system and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. We're both members of ASHA SIG 12 and both serve on the AAC Advisory Group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I am a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech-Language Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. I literally every single time I say that
You
intro,
want to celebrate it.
I want to say hooray. Without fail. And then I stop myself from saying hooray, and then I want to say huzzah. I don't know why. It's like this weird script that I have off of a script. The problem.
You there chained those together.
I totally have chained them together. If any listeners out there have any suggestions for other nonsense or silly words that I should or should not be saying after this intro, I would love your feedback. Okay, so what are we talking about today?
Today, we are talking about applying aided language modeling interventions to your practice.
So we have done one episode on aided language modeling already. To some of our listeners, to our frequent listeners who may have already listened to that episode, this episode today is a little bit different, but it's going to have some of the same information. So our original aided language modeling episode, the purpose of that was to give a general overview of what aided language modeling is and what it isn't and what the literature says about it. Today's episode is going to contain a little bit more information and focus on how you actually implement aided language modeling in a treatment setting. There is going to be some review of the information from the first episode, so bear with us while we go through that, but hopefully this will have a slightly different spin.
Yes.
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 So why did we choose this topic? Why did we decide to do a deep dive into practical applications?
So this podcast kind of came about because we also wrote a blog post. We were guest bloggers. We got to be guest bloggers, which was super
very
fun. It was really cool.
And we should do a public thank to Carol Zangari, who gave us the great privilege of writing an article for her blog, Practical AAC. It was very cool.
I have to say, Practical AAC is a web resource that I direct people to all of the time. So to be able to be a part of that wealth of knowledge sharing that's happening, thanks to Carol, it was just super cool.
We love your website, Carol. Mm-hmm. We love Practical AAC. For any listeners out there who have not become familiar with this blog, it is an unbelievable wealth of resources and information related to AAC. It's Practical AAC, PRAACTICAL, AAC.com. Is it a .com?
Let's find out. We're going to ask the internet. Well, I'm asking the internet about that. I think one other thing I want to share with you guys.
Our friend, the internet.
Our friend, the internet. It's .org.
Oh, it's .org. So it's practical AAC, spelled PRAACTICAL AAC.org.
.org. And one other super cool thing about that resource is that not only are there text blogs, which was what Kate and I did, she has videos on there. There's all sorts of different types of multimedia, resources that you can check out.
And there are a lot of guest authors on there, so you really can search for a variety of different topics and different perspectives and viewpoints. So it's a multidimensional well of information. So once we had written that article for Practical AAC, we wanted to create an audio version so that, not all of us have the luxury of like sitting down and quietly reading an entire article. At least we've had this discussion many times before. For the busy clinician or the working parent or, whatever your situation, if you don't have time to sit down and read, we wanted to make an easily accessible auditory complement to that Practical AAC article. I mean, we've said enough about that. Let's just move on.
Okay, moving on. What are our learning objectives, Kate?
Okay.
What are we learning about today?
Diving right in. Okay, learning objectives today include, number one, define aided language modeling and review the evidence for it in the literature. Number two, identify specific action steps to plan for aided language modeling within a treatment session. And number three, identify specific action steps for implementation and improving aided language modeling techniques within a treatment session.
Exciting.
It is exciting. Before we get into our learning objectives, we should probably say a little bit about AAC intervention strategies in general, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Just like where aided language modeling falls in the continuum.
Yes, I think that we should. And I think that we should say, one of the first things that you'll find about aided modeling interventions is that they're called like 15 different things. So you may have heard aided language modeling, you may have heard aided language stimulation, you may have heard system for augmenting language. Like there are a lot of different terms that are used to kind of refer broadly to this not very well defined and sort of nebulous construct of like, I'm going to provide you some type of input using an aided tool, so something external to my body, as I'm speaking to the communicator.
Yes, and I think another perspective about aided language modeling that's interesting is that it's super popular.
Yes.
And when I say super popular, I mean, it's well documented in the literature. I'm not at all referring to it as like a fad. I mean that if you are a clinician who is a career launcher, you're maybe, graduated a handful of years ago, or maybe you're a seasoned clinician, but you're just starting to dip your toe in the waters of AAC. Aided language modeling is likely an intervention strategy that you have come across. It's often presented at, when you go to conferences, there are lots of presentations about it. There is information about it pretty
on
much
social media. Like you'll see the, information, you'll see it discussed in Facebook groups about AAC.
Right.
So it's out there.
Right. And I think once you understand what it is, it can be a little bit difficult to implement it because it is not just, oh, I'm going to touch the buttons on Johnny's device. There are a lot of different moving parts, and it's a little bit more of a dynamic process. So just because it's a really popular or commonly used intervention doesn't necessarily mean that it looks the same for everyone, or that you do it just one way, and it's not a program, it's not a procedure.
And I think when we look at the literature, we see that, of course, within the context of a research study, the people who are running the study are generating operational definitions and describing what their intervention procedures are. But that doesn't often, I find when I read research, it doesn't really directly translate to what I do as a clinician, in my clinical practice. So that's true for aided modeling. And it's true for other interventions also. So I think it's worth mentioning that although we're focusing on aided modeling today, there are a lot of other interventions that you may have heard of, things like discrete trial training or behavior chaining, or, a lot of different type prompting procedures that kind of combine together to create your treatment package. When we think about aided modeling, just like any other element of that treatment package, you're going to want to think about your individual variables in your treatment environment, with your communicator, with their communication partners. So it's something that involves planning, should involve planning, which we'll talk more about.
Exactly. Well said. So let's get into some of the underpinnings of learning objective number 1. Define aided language modeling and review the evidence for it in the literature. So tell me, Amy, what is it? What is
So
aided language modeling?
what is it? Great question. I think you, as the clinician, to some extent, are defining what it is for each individual, and each team that you're supporting. Broadly, aided modeling interventions include all of these different approaches. Like we had said, it could be system for augmenting language, augmented input, aided language stimulation, aided language modeling, natural language modeling. Those are all terms that you can find in the literature. And they refer broadly to the idea of, as the communication partner, when I'm speaking to the communicator and supporting them in learning how to navigate and access their communication device, learning the vocabulary, I am modeling those keywords on the device to talk to the person in the context of sort of just our natural exchanges with one another. And I think the big distinction for me between modeling and a different intervention approach, such as prompting, is that in the case of modeling, it's me as the communication partner using the device to talk. I'm not using the device with the, agenda of like providing a cue for what I want the communicator to say to me. I'm not prompting. I'm just using it to talk to the person in a naturalistic environment to sort of provide that immersion.
And when we were preparing for this episode, we had a really interesting discussion about this concept between what is a model and what is a prompt. And I think that it's a really important discussion. It's a question that I get asked all the time, particularly if you work in an ABA setting, which I do. I work in an ABA setting. I'm a dually certified BCBA. And modeling is a prompting strategy that is very commonly used in an ABA setting and a variety of other settings. So I get asked the question all the time, well, I'm not going to model on the device because then I'm just prompting him and I want them to do it independently. So tell us, Amy, how would you answer that question for our listeners who get that question?
So if you're getting that question, or maybe you have that question yourself, I would point you toward an article by Sennett, Light, and McNaughton in 2016, and we'll have that citation up on our website. And they do a really nice job in their article just distinguishing the difference between AAC modeling, what they call AAC modeling, and what they call instructional modeling. So that's really what Kate's talking about, is instructional modeling. So yes, I'm modeling, just like if I want you to do a silly dance, I might do that silly dance myself. I wouldn't. I can't dance. Anybody who does can't dance.
For those of you who can't see Amy right now, she's doing a little shimmy. That's lovely.
So in that context, I am providing a model of the silly dance because I want you to do the silly dance.
You want me to imitate your silly dance right now?
I want you to imitate me. Yes. That is really different than what they're talking about in AAC modeling, which they define as a naturalistic communication interaction, which is a dynamic process between at least two people, highly interactive, bidirectional, multimodal, and occurs naturally, right? So that's super different. And I think when we think about really structured prompting hierarchies, like the example that you gave, Kate, so let's say maybe I want you to say juice, and I'm going to hold my finger over the buttons for the icon sequence that you might need to press to say juice. That would be instructional modeling. I'm giving you, visual supports, or I guess I'm providing the model. Maybe first I show you how to say juice, and then I want you to say juice in that same manner. That's instructional. It's more structured. It might still take place in kind of a naturalistic environment. Maybe it is snack, or we're drinking juice, and so I provided a model for juice, and then you said juice. And I think when we think about aided modeling, it's less structured than that, and the ultimate goal is not that I have Kate say juice just like I did. It's that I'm just providing her visual supports in this same modality.
So to use that same example of juice, an aided language modeling approach would maybe be sitting with the communicator. You're both having snack together and you're commenting on your own delicious juice.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
You're talking about whatever it is that you're talking about. And the intent is a social exchange. The intent is not, I'm going to say juice so that you say juice.
Correct.
So
if I'm
my grape juice is delicious, but I really wish I had, I was about to say strawberry juice. I've never even heard of strawberry juice, but I really wish I had, I really wish I had apple juice, or my juice is really, really warm. Gross. I really want to go get an ice cube. These examples are so absurd. Warm juice. But in that example, I'm maybe modeling the word juice as I have a social exchange talking about my juice.
Your juice. Or you could say, this is delicious juice. And depending upon your communicator's level, like you might model both the word delicious and the word juice on the system while saying this juice is delicious.
And also drinking delicious juice.
And delicious. You drink the delicious juice. And then your communicator might say, mine too, right? So the ultimate goal is that we have a reciprocal social interaction. Not that like I then want you, Kate, to imitate that this is delicious juice.
Right. So and again, this is a really great article. When we were having this discussion, the verbiage in this article and how this article describes the difference between AAC modeling and instructional modeling, I found really helpful. Sennett, Light, and McNaughton, 2016. The reference is on our website. Go look it up if you would like to read more about that. But I do think that it's an important distinction. And I don't know if you get this question a lot in your part. I get this question all the time.
I think the reason that it's an important distinction as a clinician is less about like, oh, I need to be very clear on what type of modeling I'm doing. And I think it's more just being conscious about not just doing directive instructional modeling, right? Mm-hmm. If that's appropriate. And we'll get into some of these factors later, and we'll share some planning forms that, we kind of have up on the Practical AAC website and up on our website that you're welcome to use. So because if you have a client who you feel like you want to be using aided modeling interventions as part of your treatment package, and you think that this is an effective tool for them, you want to be conscious yourself and aware that you're not just using modeling in the context of instructional opportunities, directives. You really want to be aware that you're identifying and then taking advantage of the opportunities that are occurring incidentally throughout the day. I think that that's like the most important reason to be aware of kind of the different pieces there.
No, and I this is just me and my experience. I find that is unbelievably, it's crucial, and also requires a lot resources in terms of staff training and communication partner education and training in general, to capitalize on those natural communication opportunities and exchanges.
Well, and I think it's for a lot of people, it's a shift from a highly directive interactional style to a more reciprocal interactional style. And I think that when you hear, when you go to a conference and you sit in a session and you hear about aided language interventions, sometimes that's stated explicitly and sometimes it's not. But I think that to me, when I've sat in these sessions and thought about what the speaker was saying, those are pieces that I take away, right? Is the idea that, kind of along with an aided modeling intervention is the idea that it's less directive. You're building this different kind of incidental, reciprocal communication style. And we tend to be really directive, often communication partners with especially younger children in general. So just being aware of that and being aware of modeling multiple types of communication.
I think that's such a good point. So now that we have a little bit of the lay of the land in terms of aided language modeling and what it is and what the literature says, I think would be a good idea to start talking about and thinking about what things you need to consider when you are interested in introducing aided language modeling into your clinical work.
Right, because we talked about how, it's not, I think that's another piece too that makes it a little bit harder than instructional modeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're thinking like, I just want Kate to say delicious juice, that's all I need to think about is what my agenda
Because
is.
delicious is my target word in my IEP objective, and
That's
I
right.
need to make sure that you have met this objective before my meeting with the parents
Right.
in a couple of weeks.
That's right.
That's
So
not what
delicious
we're, that's
juice,
not the
delicious juice.
right.
Correct. So when you're thinking more naturalistic and more global and less directive, then you need to think about more variables.
Right. Exactly. And there are so many variables. So, in terms of trying to unpack what a naturalistic communication exchange is and all the things that you would need to consider when, thinking about how to create and embrace more of these naturalistic communication exchanges. This sounds so simple, but thinking about what your client or student is interested in.
Yes.
What are they interested in? And I think this is an even more important one and maybe less obvious to a lot of people, but what routines happen frequently?
Right.
So, and this I think also goes back to choosing communication targets. Like, it's great if the word delicious is a target and you think that that word is an important word for them to have, but how many opportunities do you have to use the word delicious throughout the day? And there's this focus on core vocabulary. Yes, all of that is true, but there are some core vocabulary words that might happen more frequently than others for different students or communicators, depending on their interests, depending on their school day, depending on stakeholder input. And I think that those two things, general interests and frequent routines and frequent opportunity, are two really important things to consider when planning for an aided language modeling exchange.
And when we think about aided language modeling, it also is an intervention that has multiple elements of communication that it supports, right? So we are providing, contextual models of expressive communication, but you also might be helping to support receptive communication
Mm-hmm.
by pairing, a more consistent visual symbol with your auditory oral output. So when we're thinking about, you might want to model specific functions of communication that you're not seeing that often in your client. So thinking about that as you're keeping in mind, okay, so where are their interests? Where do their interests lie? And where are those frequent opportunities for communication? So just to connect the idea of pragmatic functions to different interaction styles, one thing that we see a lot when you have a very highly directive style is we tend to ask a lot of questions, give a lot of directions, but make very few comments, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just being aware of that and being aware that you are possibly targeting things that maybe your client isn't using at all, but someday you would like them to use. So we're going to provide many, many examples of how those words could be used naturally in natural, functional, meaningful, and hopefully enjoyable and super fun activities.
So sort of taking a step back, we have talked about what it is, some with the different names that it goes under, some things that the literature says. What does it look like? So we had mentioned this in our previous episode about this concept of aided language modeling as a general description of interaction and reciprocal exchange. That is a pretty big gray area, right? I mean, that could look a million different ways for a million different people. So in my experience, when clinicians are just starting to practice aided language modeling with their aided communicators, there can be some, not necessarily confusion, but question about, okay, well, how many times should I select the target icon? And should I talk while I get these questions from parents too. Should I be silent? Should I only verbally repeat the icon that I'm selecting? Should I say a whole sentence and just communicate naturally? What do I do? Just to be pretty simple about it. What do I do? And I think, the answer to all of those questions can differ a lot depending on the profile of the communicator.
Yeah, and I think it should be individualized also. I think that, when we read through the research, you see, some very specific things, right? Like the Draeger et al. Article 2006, they gave this like very specific criteria they used in their study about, when you point to a symbol, you point to a referent, you don't want more than a 2-second delay. You're trying to provide, we had an article we read by Binger and Light in 2007, where they're saying, you want to try and get, you have the dosage of 30 models in a 15-minute session. As you read through the literature, these are good things to put in your brain and think about, but it doesn't mean that that's the only right way to do it. And it doesn't mean that that's the right approach for your specific client. I think that what is the right approach kind of universally is to be thoughtful about it and to be clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it for your particular client, and then be constantly considering that again and making revisions as necessary. I know personally for me, I think about the kind of zone of proximal development for both my client and my communication partner.
Mm-hmm.
So what is their length of utterance right now? How many words are there? Are they using primarily single words and they're using maybe 20 different single words expressively? Then, maybe my big focus is just on building that single word vocabulary. So most of my modeling is single words on the tool. Doesn't mean I'm just going to say single words with oral speech unless I have unique client factors that make me make that choice clinically, which I might do. Are people used, do I have a communicator who's starting to use some 2-word combinations? Then I might, encourage partners to use 2 to 3 word combinations. They're just right where they are and one step beyond. However, sometimes you have a partner who's brand new to the system. And so we also want them to feel successful. So it's a bit of a balance. You might just ask the partner to do a lot of single words until they feel comfortable, and then kind of bring them back up to the communicator's zone.
I think that considering it's probably not too much of a leap to say, consider the zone of proximal development of your communicator, your aided communicator, because that's our job, is to work within the zone of proximal development. But the idea of the zone of proximal development of your communication partner is, I think, it's tremendously important. I think for a lot of our parents and a lot of communication partners, working with AAC is novel. It's, intimidating. It's, if you're not tech savvy, it's, and it's a high tech tool that can be a whole other component. So, going back to that literature by Binger and Light in 2007 about this recommended dosage of 30 models in 15 minutes, that's a pretty big ask for someone who is maybe not comfortable with the tool, hasn't had any training with the tool. Maybe you don't have the buy-in that you need to have, or even if you're a clinician and you hear those 30 models in 15 minutes and you're thinking to yourself, all right, well, that's great, but I have to keep this kid engaged. I have to hold a clipboard. I'm trying to take data. I'm trying to be social and engaging and high energy. How can I possibly try and do all of this at once? I think that, yes, it's a bumper in the road, but considering yourself in your own zone of proximal development and the zone of proximal development of your communication partners is super important.
Well, and I think too, what we found, it's something that was really interesting for me when we did the aided modeling podcast, the first podcast.
The episode, yeah.
Yeah, in reading through that literature, some of the research that's been done on modeling interventions are also done on populations who are very different from the clients that I may be working with. So that's just something else to keep in mind as you're reading through the literature, or you're reading through, ASHA's practice portal, or some of these other statements or some of these other resources that sort of synthesize the literature. Be aware of, did they do this intervention with a lot of people who were, 1 standard deviation below the mean on the receptive language, but had, intact sensory and motor systems. So there are a lot of things that should come into play when you're making determinations about what's best for your clients, and you just want to individualize it.
Right. And, I think one of the big takeaways there is that it's okay if the way you are modeling with your client or student looks differently than a colleague, or the way you do it with a different student. I mean, you'll develop your own, I guess you could say, style, but rhythm and, sort of communication style through aided means based on all of those other contextual and environmental factors.
But by planning for your intervention in advance, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, it helps you be really mindful about the why you're doing it. So you're not just doing it because in this moment with this one toy, that was the word you could find. You're making a conscious decision to kind of consider those unique client variables And then hopefully you're also collecting data as you're using the intervention and determining, okay, does this feel like the right amount of modeling? Do I need to troubleshoot some element of this environment or this type of modeling? So it should, while it's going to be very individualized, it should be informed by your client needs and the needs of their communication partners and a lot of different variables. Which is doable.
Let's use that as a segue into learning objective number 2. So identify specific action steps to plan for aided language modeling within a treatment session. This sort of subheading we had for this was, what do I do next? Right? So you know what it is, you know that there are these bumpers in the road of, quote unquote dosage, that it needs to be customized, but how do you customize it? How do you go about doing that? And in general, if you break that down into smaller parts, it's a little less intimidating and feels more doable. And just like everything else we do, it should be no surprise that one of the first things that you should be doing is considering your client's overall strengths and areas of need, and considering all of the different components of what they bring to the table. What's their attention like? What is their receptive and expressive language like? Do they present with sensory needs? And what are their access methods?
Yeah. These are all really important variables. And as you work with your clients, you will probably find other categories that you can insert in there as well. If you look at the planning form that's up on our website, you can use that form, you can tweak that form. It's really just there for you to get you thinking about what are different systems that you should be like considering about, not AAC systems, but like components of your client that you should be thinking about. It's not just receptive and expressive language. I guess that's the big takeaway.
Right. That's the big takeaway. And we do have a form. We'll talk about that form in a second. That's a planning form, sort of a graphic organizer. It's a table.
I mean, this is a table. I love a table.
To help you sort of plan and think through all these things. And I think for me, one of the biggest things that I see, I guess, overlooked. So I think most clinicians consider receptive and expressive language, most SLPs, that's sort of our whole purpose of existing on the team, is to consider receptive and expressive language. But some of these other components have a huge impact on aided language modeling interventions, and they might not be front and center, but maybe they should be. The one that jumps out to me the most is attention. So in my practice, I've seen this a lot. I did a team training. We talk about aided language modeling. I educate the team on what it is. I maybe even show them a little bit, and then I walk by the classroom, or I pop in, getting ready to do my consult, and the staff member or teacher is modeling away, and it looks beautiful, except Johnny's eyes are out the window. The attention is not a factor.
And I think, another important point to make is that eyes on doesn't necessarily mean attention, and attention doesn't necessarily mean eyes on, right? So those also aren't synonymous. And that's another piece that's important to remember for each individual client. You need to know your client and know what that means. I have some students who, pay the best attention when they're not looking, and then other people who that's not the case at all. So use your individual knowledge, your individual clinical knowledge to make these decisions on a customized basis. But yes,
I made Johnny and his poor teacher sound like they were really, or that I was making a poor assessment. I think the takeaway is that, just, again, just to really hammer it home, consider things outside of just receptive and expressive language skills, and attention, sensory needs, and access methods are all going to be important components to an aided language modeling strategy.
Well, and I'm sorry, just one more attention piece.
Oh, no.
But when you think about using an aided tool, the joint attention demands for that are actually quite high. So joint attention can be a challenge for many of our clients who are emergent communicators. So the ability to, share gaze with somebody, reciprocal gaze, then share gaze to a referent, then back to the person. That's a lot of load there. And then when we add in an additional tool. So there are also things that you can do, are there things that you can do with your body and your positioning to help mitigate some of those challenges for your client? Those are all considerations. And sometimes, while it's not like under the research umbrella of aided language modeling, I think there are also times when the aided tool might become a gesture, an unaided support. So it's a communication system. It's not just because you have an AAC device that has to be the only way that you're allowed to communicate. All of us use multimodal communication. So a lot
Such a
of
good
variables
point.
in the attention bucket.
This is one of those things that Amy reminds me of on a regular basis when we brainstorm clinical issues. It's a system, not just one tool. I think it's a good takeaway. And there are other things that I think are really important things to consider, like the social targets or the pragmatic targets that or the pragmatic, I guess, exchanges is a better word, where you would like to see these kinds of things, like reciprocating a greeting at circle time or saying that's mine to a peer. I think this is sort of getting back to us being very instruction driven, that we tend to, and this is a blanket statement, but at least in my personal experience, tend to not think of those incidental communication exchanges as opportunities to embed aided language modeling.
And I mean, we're like, instruction's not bad. Instruction's not a dirty word. There's a reason we all go to school. I mean, I think that instruction's
not a dirty word.
Right. It's
and
not.
We put that on a mug. Oh my God.
But I think it's when it gets lost, right? When all the other things get lost, and we don't want that to happen. So
that's very important.
So far, we're thinking about client variables like their attention, receptive expressive language, sensory needs, access methods. Then we're thinking about the tasks, like Kate was saying. So we're thinking about what is it that we actually want the person to do, and thinking again, not just about vocabulary, syntax, grammar, morphology, but also thinking about the pragmatic component of it too. Maybe we want you to participate, like just take a social turn. And it's not about what you say, it's about taking your turn in that level of independence. So that's where kind of the speech and language skill target is embedded, is in that part.
And I think there's a lot to say about how to, choosing the targets in terms of, the social application, that how motivated the student is, what their interest level is. But the environmental considerations, I think, are also really important.
Yes, definitely important, because to get back to when we've identified the client's needs as far as attention, and we've identified what our goal tasks are for them to accomplish, that could look very different in different environments. Having worked outpatient, I was very aware as an outpatient clinician that my outpatient environment, which was a relatively neutral room, I didn't really have a lot up on the walls. I had like total control of all the fun things. They were in a bin. That's not real life. That might be a great opportunity to acquire some initial skills, but that doesn't mean that when my client goes home, they're going to use those same skills in a really busy environment where they don't actually, like, they have free access to these different things. There's not kind of that contrived communication environment. So just being aware of variables in the environment. And again, for some people, if you have like I personally don't do well with a lot of background noise. It's a challenge for me to keep my focus. It's a challenge for me to pay attention.
That is a challenge for you.
It is. So if you have, you should see, I have a shared office, and I like have these giant headphones, and I'm playing like
I can't. But do you play music in your headphones?
I play classical music because I can't play music with lyrics.
That demands all of my attention. It's white noise or nothing, or silence.
Yeah. So see, different. Here we are, two different people with two different environmental needs. So just be aware of considering that's a factor for your clients also, just like it's a factor for you.
So in thinking about all of the things that we just said, which is a lot of things. Okay. I got to pick a target. I got to consider, all these things. I have to consider all the things. Amy and I, as we were discussing this, really agreed that the best way to tackle all of that is to write it down. Yeah. Everything is more manageable on paper. And writing and organizing all of these different variables and specifying how they pertain to your client or student can really help you plan and consider each individual factor, and also figure out how those individual factors influence each other. So, writing down the specific presentation of your client and their strengths and needs, writing down the targets, writing down descriptions of the environment and maybe ways that you could modify the environment, noting different concerns that you have, making a list of the different accommodations that you might be able to make ahead of time, including, maybe giving a little bit of extra training to a communication partner, an aide, or someone who is going to be in that environment on a regular basis. And making another list of potential unaided or concrete aided supports, which are objects. Amy put that in parentheses for me. When she wrote concrete aided supports, I was like, oh man, what is that? It's an object. It's a tiny object.
I should have just said things.
You could have just said things. But, back to Amy's point, and something that she says to me all the time, it's a system. People don't just communicate with one way all the time. So making a list of some of those unaided or concrete aided supports objects that you might want to incorporate if you're maybe in a setting where the device isn't reasonable or appropriate, or maybe it's a different goal and objective that you're working on.
And you certainly don't have to use a planning form all the time, but I think that what's helpful about some type of planning form, and you can also Google them. There's a lot of them on the web. You can find like different intervention planning forms. I want to say that Gail Van Tatenhove has a bunch of great stuff on her website, and
She
even
has
if she
so
doesn't
much
have
great stuff on her website.
A planning form
Hi,
for
Gail
this,
Van
you should.
Tatenhove.
Hi, Gail. Thank you for sharing all your great forms.
Website.
Yeah, so she's got great things that you should check out. But it's just a helpful exercise. I think if you're feeling like it's too much to manage to think about all these variables, I think having a planning form can help the first few times you try and do it to just wrap your head around that thinking process.
Could not agree more.
And don't feel like you have to do all the activities at once. Pick one or two things and like fill it out for that. See how those go, and then add to it. Keep it manageable for yourself as well.
To sort of recap, the action plan for planning is to write it down, but I think that's a good segue into our final learning objective. Identify specific action steps for implementing and improving aided language modeling techniques and within a treatment session. So we know what it is. We've talked about all the different things that you need to consider, and one specific concrete thing that you can do to plan for it. Now let's talk about what specific action steps you can take for implementing and improving aided language modeling in an actual session. So I think casually, the first thing that you should do is try it. You've planned it. You've thought about it. You don't know what will work until you give it a try and note your successes and then try to reflect on your failures. If you've gone through the procedure of thinking things through, considering all of the really important variables, make a plan for when you're going to try it. Bring your graphic organizer, bring your notes, bring your table, bring your sheet, bring whatever it is that you made, and maybe take a little bit of extra time to modify the environment ahead of time so that you feel more comfortable and you feel set up for success within your session. You can try it. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, so you don't have to take really rigid data. Like you just think about it and be mindful about what you're doing and what you feel like is working well and not well in the moment.
Yes. And the infographic that we have on our website has a place where you can take data within your graphic organizer, which might give you a nice way to sort of reflect on all of these different variables and which components worked well and which didn't. But you don't have to take data on the same sheet. We personally feel like it's, why reinvent the wheel, and, have multiple pieces of paper that you can't, you've got your data on one pink sticky note and you've got all these 5 other handouts. Try and make it more of a cohesive tool for you. It might be a really nice way to reflect on what went well, what didn't go well, so that you can make tweaks moving forward.
And you might find back to some of those client factors. You might find when you're in your session, oh, there's this other thing that I didn't even think about that I should have thought about.
Right.
And so you can make a note on your form.
Write it down.
Write it down.
Make a note. So one of the final things that you could do is what we call review, revise, and repeat. Sort of similar to what we were just saying, looking at your data, reflecting on your data, what worked, what didn't work, make some slight changes and tweaks to that, and, try it again. We both feel pretty strongly about data, if anybody's listened to this podcast before, but data doesn't necessarily just mean tally marks.
Right.
Qualitative data is also really important. So maybe you scribbled that, Johnny seemed bored. I don't know, something really casual. That is really good information. My point being, it's a weird example. My point being, it doesn't have to be a tally mark. It doesn't have to be mathematical. Qualitative data in these situations can be really helpful when you're reflecting to improve upon aided language, your intervention strategy.
Well, and when you think about the data that you're collecting, it's not just about your client. It can also be about yourself, right? So one thing that makes modeling intervention challenging, I think, is that you have an extra thing with you. So maybe it's really hard to manipulate all these different things that you want to troubleshoot that. And you might just remind yourself, this was really hard. And I think that this aspect of the interaction is what made it hard.
So review, revise, repeat. Consider your qualitative data, consider your quantitative data, let it guide your decision making, reflect afterwards, do a little journal on your planning worksheet.
And know that you might end up deciding that some interventions are a better fit for certain targets and environments than others. Like, that's okay too. You don't have to say the one right way to model. The one right way for me to model when I'm talking to Kate is, no, it might be, when we're one-on-one in a quiet environment, I do these things.
Right.
When we're doing something different and she's not super into the activity, I do this other stuff.
The final step in the action plan for implementing and actually improving your aided language modeling interventions, we had the review, revise, repeat, and the final step would be share it, review it, revise it, repeat it. So once you have a little formula that you think has been working, you've tried it, you've reflected, you've taken data, you've revised it, you tried it again, you took data, you reflected, you revised it, and you have a system, maybe this takes, depending on how often you're seeing your student or client, maybe this takes a week, maybe it takes a month, but you've gotten down to a little bit of a science. You're in your comfort zone. You know which components work. You know which variables were more salient or less salient. You've thought about what was motivating your client, what was interesting, the frequency with which those targets and why you chose them. It's really important to share it with the other communication partners and stakeholders in that student or client's life, because aided language modeling is an evidence-based practice that ideally would be pervasive across communication partners.
Right. And I think regardless of your work environment, that's relevant. So, I think back to when I worked outpatient. When you're outpatient, you have a lot of contact with the parent and guardian. How great to help them become an integral part of this intervention in real life, naturalistic, meaningful, functional opportunities across the home. So how do you do that though, right? Because we just talked through kind of a multi-component process where we were constantly thinking about how it felt for us as the clinician, kind of developing this implementation approach. We should probably also get similar feedback as we're sharing it with others.
Right. So, and I think this is also piggybacked onto an issue we've talked about in previous episodes related to collaboration. Getting that feedback can be hard. You don't necessarily have time in your day. You don't necessarily have contact with those other professionals or communication partners. So actually the physical components, the actual contact, not everybody has the privilege of sitting down and being like, so I had this series of great sessions. I really feel like I figured something out. It's working well. I'd love to talk to you about it. You don't necessarily have the other communication partners' undivided attention for a period of time. If you do in your work setting, that's great for you. And
take advantage of that.
We have jealous feelings because that's not how I think a lot of work settings operate. We highly recommend creating handouts or permanent products, tables, and infographics that you can distribute to communication partners as a general visual support for that environment. This could be things that you're hanging up on a tack board it's called a tack board, right?
I don't call anything board? That.
You've never heard of a tag board?
A bulletin board?
I think I call it a tag board. Is that because I'm from south of the Mason-Dixon line and I have a different vernacular?
I think so.
I'm gonna ask the internet that
What
question.
do you call the sandwich that you get at a pizza shop?
Ooh, off topic, but a very good question. I grew up calling it a sub. My husband calls it a hoagie.
I call it a sub.
When I went to college, it was a grinder.
I'm also grinder. Yeah. sub, grinder, hoagie, never hoagie.
Hoagie? Never hoagie?
Never hoagie. No.
Oh, that's
I
interesting.
don't know. All right. We digress.
Anyway, tag board.
Tag
Have
board.
a tag board.
If you have one, or a bulletin
or a
board.
bulletin board, or cork board, or whatever
Right.
you call it, wherever you are in the country. My train of thought now, because all I'm thinking about is the fact that I said
I think you were saying that you can share
Oh,
you
God.
can share visual supports about the modeling
Yes.
intervention in the places to help remind people kind of the key considerations for when they're implementing those supports.
Right. And I think it's, really important if you do have an opportunity to check in with the communication partners, make sure that they know how important their feedback actually is. If you have an opportunity to get feedback from them about their concerns or issues or what's working well for them and what's not working well for them so that they can participate in aided language modeling in their environments, that is huge. So, but that gives you another hurdle. How do you do that, right? There are probably a lot of barriers, like we said, to getting that kind of feedback, scheduling conflicts, bandwidth, productivity standards, all the time in general. So there are a couple of different ways that you can get that information outside of a conversation. And we would highly recommend a checklist. We have one on our website that is free that you can download. You could also do a more formal data collection process if you have that available to you. But either way, we highly recommend that you gather this information and collective feedback from stakeholders and then reintroduce it into the review, revise, repeat. So if the classroom teacher or some other communication partner has given you the feedback that certain variables or components are either irrelevant or more relevant, attention shifts in different places, or aided strategies are working more or less well in different places, are unaided strategies working more or less well in different places. Take all of that feedback and review it and revise it, and then try it, repeat it, so that you can try and improve the aided language modeling experiences across those different environments.
Yeah, so that all of the communication partners are feeling successful in implementing the intervention, because people will only try so many times something that feels very unsuccessful. So
That's
by helping make sure that all the communication partners recognize that their input is valid and could lead to modifications of the recommendations in that environment. So it's really important that you're conveying to the communication partners that their input really is important and meaningful, and that they know something about the interaction in that environment that you don't. So again, if you're outpatient and you're trying to extend some of these modeling interventions into the home with the family, make it clear to them that you're not judging their ability to implement the right way. And you can't see my air quotes.
No right way.
There's no right way. And so helping make it clear to all of the people that you're working with to support the communicator that their input is going to help shape what is the right way for them in that moment, in that environment. And that the right way, air quotes, can't see them, it's a podcast, that's going to change over time. But that their input is crucial to collaboratively developing what that is together as a team.
That is so well said. And here. Of course, I 10,000% agree. But I think, communication partners, because we tend to be, I guess, depending on your work environment, you may or may not have a lot of access to different communication partners. But this is really a huge piece and fundamental piece of success for communicators in general, as particularly, aided communicators. And communication partners have so many different experiences with an aided communicator. They have different environments that they communicate in. They use different vernacular probably. They are more or less aware of different targets that may or may not be relevant. They might use different morphological or syntactic structures based on their communication history with that individual. So it's just so unbelievably important to get that input. So I think that sort of wraps us up. We just said a whole lot of things. I think the takeaways are that you should not be intimidated by using aided language modeling strategies. If you are, if Now that you have a good understanding of what it is, we encourage you to think really hard about all the different variables that influence aided language modeling, write it down, use a worksheet, use a graphic organizer. We have one for free on our website. Try it, revise it, figure out what works, keep what worked, scrap what didn't work, tweak it, do it again, get into a groove, and then share it with the communication partners. Conduct interviews if you can, have conversations if you can, get the feedback from communication partners. If you are not able to do that because of work restrictions or issues with your schedule or time, give them a permanent product. Put something in their mailbox, use a table, use a written document. We have an example of that on our website as well that is free and available for download. And as always, data. Use your data, qualitative and quantitative. Reflect on it and use it to change and tweak your intervention to make it more successful. So I think that's it. That was a whole lot. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. Cruise on over to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com, if you'd like to purchase a certificate of attendance for ASHA CMHs. If you'd like a handout, handouts are available as well. If you listened while you were driving or doing dishes or going for a run or whatever. And we also have some free downloads available for graphic organizers and permanent product for interviewing communication partners if anyone is interested in using them. So we love hearing from you. Leave us a review, send us an email, and we hope to hear from you soon.